So my name is Francisco Muñoz. I work at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Santiago, in Chile. I belong to 3 research centers there. And my presentation today is going to be about electricity market design for low carbon and flexible systems. And the ideas I'll present here are not necessarily my ideas. There are a lot of my ideas here, but I also share contributions and suggestions by friends from Chile and one friend from Belgium. You may know him, Anthony. Okay, so I have a very ambitious agenda and presentation. I have way more slides than Luis, so I'm going to have to go fast in order to meet the time that you gave me to present. So here's the outline. I'll first talk about the ongoing transition of the electric power industry. Then I'll talk briefly about the challenges of these transitions, and then I'm going to talk about considerations or recommendations on how to address these challenges. So I want to start with a little irony. Luis started with a slide showing the book Spot Pricing of Electricity by Fred Trippi. In reality, the foundational theory that we use to define markets, electricity markets, started way before Fred Trippi. It started with this French economist and engineer, Mr. Marcel Boiteau, and he's the intellectual author of the theory of peak load pricing. When he created this theory, he was really thinking about how to price electricity in a regulated monopoly with time-varying demand. And what he found was that if you price electricity at marginal cost and you allow for scarcity prices, then you can recover, in the optimal solution, you can recover all fixed costs. And then we had the contribution of Fred Trippi and other colleagues from MIT. What they were thinking were, well, how can we control demand? How can we send demand signals so they can become more flexible? So they came up with this theory of spot prices. You can compute spot prices considering all relevant constraints from the system, and you can use the resulting prices to incentivize efficient consumption of electricity, which we call demand response today. What is the irony of this is that the theory of peak load pricing, the theory of Fred Trippi and his collaborators provide the foundational theory to deregulate markets. They were not thinking about that when they worked on this theory, and we still have little demand participation. In reality, we have used this theory to control generation, but not demand. Okay, so what's the transition? Well, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. You might already know about it, but the challenges from the transition come from the impressive growth in the investments of the renewable energy industry. If you look at price cost projections from the Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Lab from the last 2 decades, you're going to find that they were all wrong. Like, the costs went down way faster than expected, and they keep going down. And this has incentivized big, large investments in renewables. This is another concern. It's about climate change. This plot is not from a group of activists. It's from the Central Bank of England. And what they have here is the net CO2 emissions for the world, for the UK, where we're at now, different possible trajectories, and what could happen in all the possible trajectories. And basically what they say is that if we don't do anything and we keep emitting more carbon emissions, we are going to end up in a world where there are lots of physical risks arising from climate and weather-related events. And if we do something, meaning that we impose carbon prices and we achieve net negative global emissions by 2100, there will be other types of risks. This will be financial risks, and these risks emerge from the transition to a low carbon economy. Because of the previous graph, many countries and individual states are already implementing carbon pricing mechanisms. I just downloaded this plot from the World Bank. I didn't know that here in Brazil you are discussing the possible implementation of an emission trading mechanism or a carbon tax, still not implemented. And all of these concerns and policies are driving even more investments in low carbon generation. Another source of risks and challenges: emerging technologies, electric transportation, smart appliances, electric vehicles, distributed generation, distributed storage. And this is something that is not as new, as I used to have this back in Baltimore when I did my PhD, more demand participation. Okay. So what is the challenge? The challenge is that with the integration of all of this renewable energy, the world is looking quite different than what we had to deal with before this integration. One of the issues is the variability and unpredictability of these new resources. This plot is from California, so it's called the spaghetti plot. And it's what it shows is wind generation for 24 hours for the same site for different days. So if you look at the average is quite flat, but if you look at every day, the wind conditions change constantly. And this is a concern that we didn't have before. So now we have to deal with that. And another concern is the large increase in solar generation, especially from distributed energy sources. This is demand for 24 hours again in California. This is what's called the duck chart, because it looks like a duck apparently. I cannot see the duck. But what they're seeing is that in the middle of the day, the net load, which is load minus renewable generation, is coming down, down, down. And this is creating challenges here early in the morning and late in the afternoon when the sun goes out, because it's creating the need for steep ramp events. That's something that they didn't have to deal with. So now they are creating new products to deal with it. So, to the point of my talk, the main point of my talk is this. So, if we want to preserve markets, and I highlight that, markets, and ensure that these new technologies are integrated in the most efficient manner, we need to first ensure that markets capture the physics of the system as closely as possible. Second, we need to reconsider mechanisms to ensure resource adequacy. We need to price scarcity. We need to price externalities if we care about decarbonizing the energy sector. And we need to reconsider the regulation of distribution system. Because of the scope of my talk, I'm gonna skip the last point. We're only going to talk about wholesale market design. So if we address these points, we will end up with a market design that is based on first economic principles. If we have that, we will build a business case for efficient investments and operations. And we have to remember that this process of market design is a dynamic process. It's not a one-time process. We will do this, and then we will learn about new challenges, and we'll probably have to go back and add new priorities and redesign the market. And that's something that is very important. So what if we don't address the previous points 1 to 5? Well, there could be misalignments between the dispatch instructions and price signals. There could be issues like generation investments of the wrong type. at the wrong locations. You could have issues like lack of flexible resources to deal with the intermittency of variable energy resources. There will be weak incentives for the entry of, for example, energy storage technologies. Those technologies leave off price volatility, active demand participation, etc. And we'll have to deal with externalities, such as too much carbon emissions. Some regulators are dealing with these problems following administrating actions to deal with these issues and not redesigning the market, such as, for example, specific requirements on new investments, on the type of location, where you want the investments. And the problem is that that's actually called central planning. And I have no problem with central planning, but when I see it, I like to call it by its name. So if we're going to do central planning, let's just do central planning. There's no problem with that. But if you care about markets, you need to focus on this. Okay, so what are the considerations going forward, or my recommendations are: first, reconciling markets and the physics of the system, the importance of multi-settlement markets in the presence of variable renewable energy resources, scarcity pricing, to reconsider capacity mechanism, and to price externalities, which in this context it's basically carbon pricing. Okay, so first topic, reconcile markets and physics. So the first topic I'm going to talk about is the importance of having a very fine temporal granularity of prices. If you think about the structure of wholesale markets, we have spot energy prices. They provide incentives to all agents to follow the instructions or the dispatch schedule proposed by the system operator. Academics like to call that prices support the solution. And we also have a set of ancillary services in most markets, which are services to deal with unexpected changes within settlement periods, these are additional payments to generators to help with, for example, primary regulation, secondary regulation, voltage support, black start, etc. Basically, these services ensure the reliable operation of the grid. If we look at a plot for 12 hours of operation in a market, basically think that the blue line here is the scheduled demand, and you're clearing the market every hour. On each one of those hours, there will be a spot price for energy. You will be crossing supply and demand every hour, and there will be one spot price. The problem is that the actual demand might be a little bit different than that, such as the red line there. And the problem is that you're going to need to engage in some administrative or corrective action to ensure that supply equals demand in every second. And that's where you will use the ancillary dispatch or ancillary services. And here you see the ancillary dispatch. So it's basically used to deal with infrequent small mismatches between supply and demand. Okay, but the bulk of the trading, the bulk of the price signal is the spot price up here. You use ancillary services to deal with sort of like marginal issues on the side. And that's when the main source of variability is demand, for example. The problem is that with more generation from wind and solar resources, you have new sources of variability. So this is, for example, an image that I got from a report from Sandia National Lab. They were looking at a 48 megawatt hour PV power plant, and they looked at during the day basically, and they looked at what is that a point sensor will predict that the plant will generate and how much the plant generates in every second basically, and you can see that the variability, there's a lot going on below the hourly resolution, basically. And the same thing happens for wind generation. This is 1 minute data from ERCOT. The light green, blue line here shows the hourly average of wind generation, and the dark blue line shows the historical or the actual wind generation. As you can see, they're not exactly the same. There are a lot of things going on at 1 minute intervals. So the issue is that low temporal granularity of spot prices will hide all this variability that remunerate flexibility under increasing shares of generation from renewables. So this has been a concern in the Chilean electricity market. We have hourly spot prices. I understand that you have weekly spot prices for 3 blocks of weekly spot prices. We have hourly spot prices, and we think that that's not enough, and that we need to transition to 5-minute prices. So we had to try to convince the regulator why this is important. So we did a simulation for the Chilean system for a week of 2022 using hourly prices, and this is basically the variability that you see for a typical week in the Chilean system. And what you basically observe is that all the price volatility comes from the differences between the daily and nightly regimes of the system. That's it. You have a daily pattern for solar generation, demand, etc., and another pattern at night, and that's it basically. So if you're a storage unit, for example, your business will be to buy low and sell high, basically. Buy during the night, charge during the night, and sell power during the day. That's it. However, if we look at the same system and we compute prices every 5 minutes, more things come up. And what happens is that there's a lot of variability of solar and wind resources below the hourly resolution that are not reflected in the hourly prices. Some of these are issues with inflexibilities, such as ramping limits, for example. And anytime we hit one of those constraints, prices can go up or down. So what's the problem with that is that if we want to make a business case for resources that will provide flexibility for the system, we need to let those technologies see these 5-minute prices. Otherwise, it will not be a business case for them to enter. So, for example, we look at the profitability of a 10 megawatt and 2-hour battery with using the 5-minute prices versus the hourly prices, with assuming perfect information. And what we found is that when you switch from the hourly prices to the 5-minute prices, there's a 38% increase in profits from energy arbitrage and an 81% increase in profits from reserves, which are not plotted here. So if you want to make a business case for resources to provide flexibility, you need to let these prices happen, basically. You need to show this resolution. Otherwise, the resources are not going to come. There will not be a business case for them to enter. And this is just an example with storage. Same thing could happen with demand response. So this is a plot that Alexandre pointed out to me, and that apparently you guys are having some issues with discrepancies between hourly prices and these weekly prices. We'll talk about that later. So how are other markets? What's the granularity of other markets? For example, in the US, which are the markets that I'm more familiar with, settlements occur every 5 minutes. You have 5-minute prices. In Peru, they compute prices every 30 minutes. In Chile, every 1 hour. So here you have weekly prices. And the issue is that unless we transition to a more granular price system, it's very unlikely that we're going to see efficient investments in flexible units. So this is the analogy I like using for people that don't understand this pricing system. Is basically think that the the pixels here in this picture indicate the need for flexibility, and what we are showing today with these low granular prices are these pixelated pictures. And that's, I think, the best way to understand it. That's the problem with using coarse price signals instead of a granular price system. Okay, the next point is about computing prices using optimization software. This is a concern in Chile, actually. So in Chile, prices are computed using something that's called the merit order curve. So I'm going to show you an example why that doesn't work well when you have renewables and what are demands for steep ramping events, for example. So you have two generation units. One is a cheap one, the yellow one. The only issue is that it has a ramping limit of 600 megawatt per hour. And we have another expensive unit that is very flexible. So it can ramp up and down without any limits. So we have two periods of demand where demand is 1,000 megawatts. The optimal dispatch for those first two periods, it's easy. It's just use all the yellow unit, basically. And then suddenly from period 2 to period 3, demand goes up to 2,000 megawatts. Ideally, you would love to use the yellow unit to supply the 2,000 megawatts of demand, but the only issue, the issue you have is that you have this 600 megawatt ramping limit, so you cannot ramp up that fast. So the optimal dispatch for the system is to use the yellow unit as much as you can, except for period 3 where you need to use 400 megawatts of the expensive unit. But then you can supply the whole demand with the yellow unit, because you can ramp 400 megawatts no problem from period 3 to period 4. So what's the point I want to make? So if you use the logic of the merit order curve, basically you look at that dispatch, and on every hour the price will be equal to the marginal cost of the most expensive unit running on the system, basically. That's what we use in Chile. Method, merit order curve, spot price equal to the marginal cost of the most expensive unit operating in the system. And here are the 4 periods. If you look at the optimal dispatch here, the price will be $30 per megawatt hour in all periods except for period 3, where we have the red unit operating, and then the price will be 70. However, if you use dispatch software, when you use dispatch software and you consider the intertemporal limits, that constraint, the ramping constraint of the system, the spot price will be computed in a slightly different way. The spot price is actually equal to the cost of supplying an additional megawatt hour of demand. So what will be the cost of increasing demand in every period by 1 unit? Turns out that prices are almost the same except for one period, period 2. In period 2, the price is negative 10. Why is that? Because if you increase the demand in period 2 by 1 unit, 2001, that will allow you to ramp up to 1 more unit in the next period. And if you can ramp to 1 more unit in the next period, you will need 1 less unit of the red generator in period 3. So the cost will go up by 30 here, by 30 here, but the cost will go down by 70 here. So it's 60 plus 60 minus 70, and that's minus 10, and that's the optimal price. And that's how system operators, for example, in the US compute prices, using the dispatch software and not this logic of the merit order curve. So what's the issue so what's the problem of not using the dispatch software and using these prices up here? Is that, once again, if you're trying to incentivize flexibility, we can use, again, the example of a hypothetical energy storage unit. You can ask the question, well, what's the value of energy arbitrage between periods 2 and 3? Well, if you have a marginal unit, energy storage unit, say you can store 1 unit of energy, you will buy 1 unit of energy in period 2, you will pay 30, and you will sell it in period 3 for 70, so your profit will be $40, right? However, if you operate on the same system but using dispatch software, you will get paid 10 for charging the unit, and you will set that energy in the next period for 70, and that will give you a profit of 80. So unless you price these constraints correctly, you will provide distorted economic signals for aging that could provide flexibility. So what's the point of that example? Is that all prices should be negative? No, absolutely no. The only point that I want to make with this is that prices are not necessarily equal to the marginal cost of some unit operating in the system. It could be something different, and that's the point. Here, the example shows that there is a negative price, but it can be something different. It could be 5, for example. However, negative prices have become much more common with increasing shares of generation from renewables. And here you see the frequency, how many hours per year these different markets face negative prices. And as you have more and more renewables in the system, it's much more likely that you're going to hit constraints that are going to basically result in negative prices. So they are expected to occur. However, that's not always true. There are places where, for example, renewables have subsidies. And if renewables have subsidies and you are in a bid-based market, and if there is oversupply, a renewable supplier might be willing to bid a negative price, basically. So it will be not necessarily because of an inflexibility, but because of a subsidy. But even in periods where there are no subsidies, market operators are still seeing negative prices. Okay, so the next point about reconciling markets and physics, it's about spatial granularity of prices. And the message here is that you should price transmission constraints. And how you should do it, you should use nodal prices or locational marginal prices. Why is that? Because those prices reflect scarcity of transmission capacity and also reflect the cost of transmission losses. And they are actually required for open and non-discriminatory access to the transmission system. And this plot shows nodal prices in the Midwest ISO, now called the Mid-Continent ISO, back in 2011 at 1 hour there. As you can see here, prices are very different at different locations. High prices indicate scarcity of generation or of transmission to import power from low price areas, basically. And that's optimal, basically. These prices give signals for new investors about where to locate their power plants. So, for example, if you're an investor, you really don't want to put your plant here. If these prices reflect long-term prices, for example, these are only for 1 hour, but say these were long-term prices, you really don't want to put your power plant here because you will not help the system. And how would that be reflected? Prices there are negative, so they really don't want to sell at negative prices, of course. So whereas that a new asset will bring more value to the system, very close to that area where there is no condition. So these LMPs serve another purpose. They actually they make it easy to plan new transmission, basically, because it's very easy to see here where is that you need new transmission capacity, where are the constraints. Ideally, you will solve that, of course, using a mixed integer program, but intuitively here you have an idea of where you need to put new transmission. There are places where there is excess generation, and there's places where there's lack of cheap generation. Let's call it that way. So these LMPs or nodal prices are important for the efficient integration of renewables because renewables are often located. The best resources are often far from load centers and the existing transmission grid. So if you don't give these prices, you might end up having investments in new renewable resources at locations where you don't want it, where they will cause too much congestion. So here's an example of, in Chile we use nodal pricing. Here we have solar generation up north in Chile, and prices at a southern node here in green, and prices at a northern node close to where the solar plants are. And what happens during the day here, we're having some issues with transmission constraints back in 2014, and prices there will collapse to zero during the day because of excess of solar generation. And that's efficient, that's fine. Why is that? Because if this is happening, you don't want more investment in solar generation at that location, unless, at least you don't want it unless we plan for new transmission. So this is really annoying for solar generation right now in Chile, but it's actually efficient pricing. Okay, so the question then is, what if we don't use LMPs? What if we use, for example, a zonal system? So we price energy, we forget about transmission constraints, we compute zonal prices, and we figure out how to deal with these constraints later, using, for example, redispatch. So if you use zonal market, it's very likely that that's going to result in an infeasible dispatch, because you dispatch and price units disregarding constraints on the system, so it's very likely that when you try to implement that, the solution is going to be infeasible. And you're going to need to redispatch units after the fact, and that's going to be very costly. In the UK, Richard Green estimated the benefits of transitioning from a zonal system to a nodal system, and he found that the UK could save around £100 million per year by just changing the way you price electricity. In Central Europe, our friend Ignacio Aravena and Anthony Papavasiliou from UC Lorraine, they asked the same question for Central Europe. In Europe, they still use zonal markets, they don't have nodal prices. And they found that basically the zonal system is costing around 600 million euros per year to the system. That's the cost of not using LMP. And there are other issues as well. California learned this the hard way back in the early 2000s when they deregulated the market. Their initial design, they did not consider transmission constraints in the day-ahead market, and generators very quickly learned that. They very quickly learned that they could game the system because there will be transmission constraints in the real time. So generators in the day ahead will, for example, bid very low to be committed for the next day, and in the real time they will bid very high. And the rules of the market said that anytime you have a forced dispatch, you have to pay the unit opportunity cost. And that's the game that Enron played there. It was called the ink and debt game, and they made millions and millions of dollars playing that. The California crisis is due to many more factors, not just the fact that they did not use nodal pricing, but this is definitely one of the reasons they had this issue. So you really don't want to have to deal with this. So we're lucky because today there is a solution to deal with this problem, and that's called the dispatch software. What is that the dispatch software do? Well, it maximizes the benefit minus the cost of the system. This is just a stylized model here. Basically, you have a constraint on basically this difference between demand and generation. It's called net injections. The dual variable associated to that constraint is the price. You have constraints that are associated to transmission losses, and we also have transmission constraints. And when you solve this problem to optimality, in the optimal solution, you get these prices, and these prices have three components: have a price at a reference bus, basically at a hub, and they also include a component of marginal losses and a component of congestion costs. So those prices support the solution that you get from solving this problem. And once again, these prices reflect all the externalities that generators or demand cause because of increasing or decreasing their consumption or generation. So Well, how much does it cost to implement an LMP market? It's not free, of course. Luckily, there are a couple of researchers from Europe that look at this question, and they retrieve some data from the US. This plot shows cost and benefits in millions of dollars. This is installed capacity for different electricity markets in the US. We have ISO New England, New York ISO, MISO, BGM. The red crosses there are the one-off implementation costs of these platforms to compute novel prices. And as you can see here, you can very easily pay for the one-off cost of implementing a novel market with the savings from 1 year. That's it. So it's really a no-brainer. So advantages of reconciling markets and physics. First of all, this is summarizing. First of all, you get feasible schedules and prices that support dispatch instruction. There is no need for administrative rules to force agents to follow dispatch orders because you're giving prices that support the solution. You have efficient locational price signals for new investment. Flexibility is remunerated efficiently if you use fine temporal granularity, and you have less reliance on ancillary services. More is built and traded in the spot market, energy spot market. Another question is, well, with more renewables, is there a socialized cost because of this intermittency and variability? And Jacob looked at this question and computed the cost related to variability because of the integration of renewables. We also have to remember that the demand is also variable. So renewables are not the only ones that are guilty of variability. There are different agents in the system that cause variability. So Jacob asked this question, are we socializing the cost of variability of renewables? So he used these models where he basically allocated benefits and costs just based on wholesale spot prices and make whole payments. And he used this benchmark using from cooperative game theory, the Shapley value, and he basically assigned costs and benefits based on the incremental contribution of each agent to variability. And surprisingly, he found that if you have a proper market design with high temporal granularity, if you consider all transmission and generation constraints, then wholesale spot prices are unlikely to create a socialized cost due to uncertainty or variability. So if you price things correctly, you're not socializing costs. Basically, that's the message here. Okay, next topic, multi-settlement markets. So these are very common in the US and in Europe. What's the idea? You have a day-ahead market where you have that's based on forecast. This market results in day-ahead prices and quantities. And these are only financial commitments, they are not physical commitments. Generators that sell in the day-ahead market get some revenues from that financial position, and then we have a real-time market that is based on realizations of demand, wind and solar generation, and this results in real-time prices and real-time quantities. These are the actual dispatch instructions. This is a physical commitment. And a generator that participates in both markets has revenues from the day-ahead market and then revenues from the real-time market. So the day-ahead market is basically, it's just a market for 24-hour contracts for differences. That's it. So this, and I call this net because this quantity could be negative. You could lose money by adjusting your position in the real time. And these are not common in Latin America. So if your quantity committed in the day-ahead and real-time market is the same, you don't care about the real-time market because you sell everything in the day-ahead market. You don't have anything to correct in the real-time market. If you produce more in the real-time market, well then that differential, it's paid the real-time price. If you produce, the problem is that if you're short in the real-time market, then you need to go and buy more power from the spot price. from the real-time market. Depending on how prices are, if the day-ahead market is the day-ahead price is higher or lower than the real-time price, you could either earn or lose money, basically, based on your position. So what's the advantage of this is that all agents have incentives to make the best possible forecast for the real-time market, because any deviation could be very costly. And since most agents are risk-averse, actually most of the trades occur in the day-ahead market. The real-time market ends up being an imbalanced market. And the third advantage is that it's very easy to set the cost of deviations by renewables, which is a big issue here right now in Chile. This is an example of the timeline of the PGM market, where the day before generators submit their offers, there is a security constraint unit commitment model that crosses supply and demand, assigns financial commitments to all of the participants in the market, and then generators can readjust their bids if they want to. And after that, there's the real-time market, where the operator runs a security constrained economic dispatch model to compute real-time prices. Another innovation in the US is the introduction of virtual transactions or bids. Virtual transactions are a set of bids and offers that are submitted in the day-ahead and real-time market, day-ahead market, of pure speculators. These are agents that don't necessarily own assets. What's the advantage of this? Well, if you look at the average difference between day-ahead and real-time prices, there's not much of a difference. So you might wonder, well, why would you want this? Well, it turns out that if you look at other measures, for example, the maximum, minimum prices, standard deviations, you're going to find that there might be opportunities to trade between both markets, just like in the stock market, basically, with the futures. There are some days where the averages are completely off. And this is, for example, this happened in the polar vortex, where the real-time price ended up being way higher than the day-ahead price. And if you're a speculator, what you will do is that you will go to the day-ahead market and you will increase demand here, because you know that you will later sell that power at a much higher price in the real-time price. So if you have enough speculators, that will basically close the gap between these two curves. What's the purpose of the virtual transactions? Well, according to California ISO, they increase market liquidity, they lower costs because they increase efficiency, and in general, they improve grid operations. These are very recent. Frank Wallach asked the question, do they actually help the system? And they looked at what happened in California when they introduced virtual bidders. This shows for different hours of the day, the difference between the day ahead and the real-time market price. If the difference is zero, you will see the horizontal curve there. Before the introduction of virtual bidding and after the introduction of virtual bidding. And what they found is that after the introduction of virtual bidding, the difference between the day ahead and the real-time price decreased significantly. They found that the introduction of virtual bidding decreased fuel costs by 3.6%. They found annual savings of $4.2 million, and they also found that the introduction of virtual bidding reduced carbon emissions. And these are pure speculators. They don't own any asset. Very cool. So back to Latin America, Chile. We don't have day-ahead market. We only have a real-time market. We do compute real-time day-ahead prices, but they're not used for settlements at all. They're only referential prices. That creates some challenges. So, for example, if you own a 10 megawatt battery, again lossless, and you operate based on day-ahead prices, because that's all the information you have. So you charge here in the middle of the day expecting to sell later on at that price. After you operate, you're going to face real-time prices, which are the prices that are actually used for the settlements, and you're going to find some surprises. The first surprise is that if you have 1 hour of storage, your profits will be 42% lower than what you expected, and if you have 4 hours of storage, your profit will be 25% lower than expected, because these are the real-time prices are exposed prices. They are posted like 1 or 2 days after operation. So units like batteries, for example, are operating in the dark. They just charge and discharge and have no idea what's going to be the price they're going to get. So big issue there. The opposite question: what if there is no real-time market and you only have a day-ahead market? So basically, you have a day-ahead market, and all the deviations from the day-ahead market, you deal with that using ancillary services, for example. Going back to this slide, that's an unnecessarily high reliance on ancillary services to deal with these trivial deviations. Why is that? Because the price formation of these services is very coarse, it's very poor. My way of interpreting this is how I explained this to the Chilean regulator. I said, look, proposing this proposal having only a day-ahead market and no real-time market and dealing with all deviations with ancillary services, it's like saying, well, from now on, every time you have a headache, we're going to call the ambulance and we're going to take you to the emergency room. The emergency room was never meant to deal with this problem. And same here, ancillary services are not meant to deal with that. It's an overkill. You don't need that. You can easily have a real-time market. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. I'm going to read it. So, advantages of multi-settlement systems. Prices in the day-ahead markets are less volatile than real-time prices. In general, most agents prefer to sell everything in the day-ahead market. It can be used to optimize energy and reserves, and virtual dealers can enhance market efficiency. Also, a day-ahead market can help to mitigate the exercise of market power. Scarcity pricing. So, most of us have taken some course on power system economics, learned that what is optimal is to set prices equal to marginal cost. In reality, hello, I can use this. In reality, what the theory says that no, we need to set prices where supply equals demand. So that's not a problem, because when we have low demand, the price is well defined. When we have medium demand, prices are well defined. The issue is that when demand is high, then it's really hard to compute the intersection between these two curves. Actually, price is not well defined. There are multiple possible solutions. So this rule that the price must equal marginal cost works as long as there is no scarcity. What is the first best solution? Well, demand participation or demand response. If you have some demand participation, you will have some elasticity. Basically, this like blue curves are a little bit tilted. And in that case, all prices will be well defined. So in that period, if you know, the price will be greater than the short run marginal cost of the most expensive unit operating in the system, and this is a scarcity price. It reflects the marginal willingness to pay for energy, not the marginal cost of the most expensive unit operating. And that was basically Fred Schweb's vision, that if you have demand response, everything becomes very easy. Second best option, value of loss flow pricing. Basically, you come up with some administrative number to price scarcity. It's the administrative solution used in most markets. And you probably understand this better than I do, because this cost of shortage gets reflected in the opportunity cost of water, of course. And this solution is often complemented with capacity markets to ensure resource adequacy, basically.
So the question is, how could we get away with this simplification for so long? This is a supply curve for the old generation mix of system. And that's because scarcity pricing is just a marginal issue. It's just a marginal annoyance. Most of the time you don't have to worry about this. It's only in a few hours that you have to care about this. The problem is that the supply curve of the new system might look a lot like this, where the marginal cost of generation for all renewables is zero until we run out of capacity, and then we're in trouble because it's all about scarcity pricing. So scarcity pricing is showing up in all the reports about electricity market design for renewables. This is an article from the European files, and this was the director of EPEX spot in Europe, where he said that only a free price formation accurately reflecting scarcity will provide the necessary flexibility to power the transformation of the power sector. This is a new proposal by the European Commission, where they ask, well, how are we going to remunerate storage efficiently? We can only do that if we allow for scarcity prices, basically. What can be done while we wait for more demand response, which is the first best solution? That's exactly what we want. Well, Professor Hogan from Harvard University proposed this administrative solution, which is basically a sloped operating reserve demand curve. When you procure ancillary services or operating reserves, you need some estimate of how much of the product you're going to procure, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, etc. And so that creates a vertical demand curve for the product, basically. What Professor Hogan proposed is that, what we know is that we have an estimate of the social cost of a shortage. That's a value flow load. And we can easily compute the loss of low probability of the system for different levels of reserves. The more reserves we have, the less likely that we're going to have an outage. If you multiply these two things, this curve with this value, you end up with a curve, basically. And then it turns out that curve can be used to define a demand curve for operating reserves. So basically what you do is you introduce elasticity into the market. You're introducing it in the reserves market, but if you co-optimize reserves and energy, that elasticity gets propagated to the energy market as well. So for example, ERCOT uses these ORTCs. They have an energy-only market, and this ORTC results in a price adder. As you can see here, there are many hours where this price adder is activated, and this is the average value of the adder in those active hours. However, if you zoom into that, you're going to find some surprises, and one of them is that prices can get to very high levels, for example, during some hours in the system. So for example, here in 2018, prices climb up to 9,000 megawatts per megawatt hour for brief periods of time, but it happened. And during those hours, all the units that were there providing energy were remunerated very handsomely, to put it in a nice way. In PGM, they have a capacity market, so they're not really concerned about resource adequacy, but they have another headache. What is the headache they have is that they have this very sophisticated ancillary services market, and what's happened is that nearly 90% of the time, those reserves clear at zero prices. Why is that? Because they are using demand curves like this one. So anytime you procure, for example, 300 megawatts of reserves, when in reality you only needed 299.5, the price is zero. That's a problem with optimization, right? With these constraints. And why they want a slope ORTC is because this curve will prevent these prices from collapsing all of those times, because they know that these are valuable products, that they're not valued properly in the market. So just one final comment here is that with more renewables, it's all about scarcity pricing. Ideally, we want more demand response, but until we have more demand response, this is one possible way to address this issue. And there's a false dichotomy between capacity mechanism and scarcity pricing. You can actually have both if you want. You don't have to pick one. They could be complementary. And now we're going to talk about capacity mechanisms. So why markets or regulators use capacity mechanisms? Well, this is closely related to the lack of scarcity pricing mechanisms. If you let prices climb up to the true value of loss load, there will be no problem, basically. However, often there are administrative price caps, and that causes a missing money problem. Generators don't have enough revenue to cover their fixed costs. So you need some supplemental payment. So what regulators have done with capacity mechanisms is basically come up with a market for capacity. They come up with a demand curve for capacity and a supply curve. You need to determine the firm capacity of all generators or units in the system, and that could be a challenge. For example, what's the firm capacity of a wind unit? And you cross supply and demand, and that gives you the clearing price for capacity. That's it. These are the demand curves for capacity for different markets in the US. One thing you have to note here is that basically all markets have some resource adequacy target that they are aiming for. And after that, their willingness to pay for more firm capacity goes to zero very rapidly. They are willing to buy some insurance, but they don't want infinite insurance. That's what these curves convey. Well, there are some challenges with capacity mechanisms. First is that with more renewables, we don't really know what are the most risky hours in the system. They used to be when the load was at the highest point and in the neighborhood of those hours, but when you have more renewables, that's not necessarily true. And that's one headache. Second headache, renewables have contribute to resource adequacy, but their marginal contribution to resource adequacy is decreasing on their penetration. The first megawatt of a wind farm contributes way more to resource adequacy than the next 3, 4, or 5 megawatts. And that has to be accounted for in capacity market, and that's hard. Third headache, PGM uses a very sophisticated capacity market, but it has one issue. And the issue is that it depends on demand forecasts. They contract firm capacity based on a forecast, 3 years in advance. And the issue is that if we look back at these last 14 years of peak demand forecasts and PGM, they have all been massively wrong, basically. And what the issue is that they have always erred on the same side. They have always overestimated the peak demand. And that means that they have, for 14 years, procured way more capacity than what is needed. And who pays for that? Final consumers. This is, in my view, the most concerning finding. The US Government Accountability Office, they try to make sure that money is well spent in the government and that FERC is doing its job. Ran a study to see if FERC is doing its job at looking at the efficiency of capacity market, and their conclusion was that they are not doing their job. What's the problem? Capacity markets, well, in the US, people spend about $51 million from 2013 to 2016, and FERC has not fully assessed the overall performance of capacity markets. And what this office says that FERC should do this job and ensure that customers do not pay more than necessary for resource adequacy. So conclusions, can capacity markets incentivize new entry? They do. Are they efficient? We don't know. That's the conclusion from this study. Let's skip that. Here's an issue with the capacity mechanism in Chile. This is the demand curve for capacity in Chile. That's the demand curve for capacity in PGM. What the problem we have in Chile now is that we don't have a clear resource adequacy target. If you see here, PGM has a clear target, and after that, the willingness to pay for more capacity goes to zero very quickly. But in Chile, we don't have that. We have this rather flat demand curve, and today we're standing here. We have a 65% reserve margin of firm capacity, not nominal capacity. And that is costing about $1 billion per year in capacity payments, and that translates into about $13 per megawatt hour for the final client. It's a huge bill. And no one really can explain why is that we have that curve. So that is very concerning. Why is this concerning as well? Because I don't know if you've followed the news. Chile is this excellent place to build renewables. We just committed to become carbon neutral by 2050. At the same time, all these news are happening, we have this. We have a record investments in diesel units. And they don't have any PPAs. And that is because of this. We have lots of new investments in diesel units that are refurbished, that retired from other countries, and they are built in Chile and never operated. So we really need to think about what is that we expect from capacity markets. I'm not saying that they don't work at all. I'm only saying that if you are going to rely on these mechanisms, you have to design them very carefully. It's very easy to make mistakes. What is the ideal analysis for resource adequacy from the Bradle group? They did this for ERCOT. Basically, what the analysis you want to run is to say, well, what is our value of lost load? And based on that, you can perturbate or change your reserve margin, and based on the value of lost load you have, if you simulate outages, you're going to find that there's a point where the total system cost is at its minimum. And that minimum includes a mix of investments in peaking plants and a little bit of firm load shedding. More reserve margin than that is not optimal because it's overspending in capacity. Less than that is not optimal either because you will be spending way too much in load shedding. The social cost will be too high. So there is one optimal point. And if you allow me, Alessandra, this is just the last point. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Carbon pricing. What's the economist's view of carbon pricing? Well, if greenhouse gas emissions are causing externalities, then just price externalities, period. Obviously, they say that because they don't think about the political consequences of doing this. But anyway, that's the optimal theoretical solution. And many countries around the world are already doing it or proposing implementing some sort of carbon pricing mechanism. How does it work? For example, a Piguvian tax. Say you have 3 generators. Say B is like a coal plant and C is a gas unit, A is a renewable unit, for example. If you pose a small carbon tax, what's going to happen is that the dispatch might not change, but the price is going to go up a little bit. So emissions are not going to go down in the short term, but the units that don't emit carbon emissions will get a rent. And that's going to give them incentives. They will be more profitable in the long term. So you have more investments in units A. If you have a high carbon tax, you can even change the dispatch order. B becomes the most expensive unit now. Say it's a coal unit. So you have carbon emission reductions in the short term and more investments in low carbon generation in the long term. How not to do it? Don't follow the carbon tax in Chile. It's a really unique experiment in the world. Why is that? We have a carbon tax, but it has 2 rules. The first rule says that the carbon tax cannot affect the dispatch or spot prices. So the operator has to operate as if the carbon tax did not exist. And there's a second rule that says that the economic losses of generators, because the dispatch is confiscatory, are prorated among all units. So how does it work? Say that's the carbon tax, it's exaggerated just to make the point. First of all, you cannot change the dispatch, so you keep dispatching A, B, and C as if the carbon tax did not exist. Second, the price ends up being P1. You cannot use a higher price. Because you don't use a higher price, there are these rents that A and C will receive under their standard tax. They will not receive it here. And the second problem is that B and C operate at a loss in the short term. And those losses, because of Rule 2, are prorated among all units. And it's what has been happening for the last 3 years is that wind and solar generators get a bill for carbon taxes at the end of the year. Which is problematic, to put it nicely. Okay, so of course we were very curious about this. We came up with some equilibrium modeling to compute the long-term effects of this carbon tax. What we found was not surprising. Basically, the carbon tax we use in Chile with these restrictions achieves much lower carbon emissions reductions than an actual carbon tax for the same tax level. Okay, it's way more inefficient because of this rule. When we ask about the whys, why is that we did it this way? There's no official answer, but the unofficial answer was because we want to protect customers. We want companies to pay for this carbon tax, not people. So by doing that, we're not letting prices go up. Okay, so we look at the dual variables on the supply and demand constraints in this long-term planning problem, and we found that that was not true. Prices increased using both mechanisms, and actually for high carbon taxes, the Chilean tax achieves higher prices than the standard tax because you end up steering the market towards an inefficient mix of generation technologies. And here's the most controversial plot of all of our paper, annual tax revenues. How much the government collects from these two different mechanisms. With the Chilean carbon tax, increasing the tax achieves linear increments in tax revenues for the government, whereas with the standard tax, it's linear in the first segment, but after that, there are decreasing marginal contributions in terms of tax revenue. And that makes sense, because with the carbon tax, what you're trying to do is to lower carbon emissions. So in the end, when you don't have carbon emissions, there are no tax revenues. So exactly, it goes down. Other problems with carbon pricing, these are emission trading schemes, volatility. Europe is facing this. Basically, they didn't use the carbon price, they used the other approach, the alternative approach, which is creating a market for emissions permits. There's a limited amount of permits every year. The problem is, once again, is that because they are using vertical demand curves, they are seeing a lot of volatility in the market. And this is problematic for investors that are trying to make decisions on whether or not to retire power plants or invest in new renewables. This is a very confusing signal. And in California, Severin Borenstein, Frank Wallach, and Jim Bushnell also found the same thing. And I'm not going to go into the details of this picture, but basically what they found is that the clearing price of the carbon permit is often the market cap or the market floor, the price floor. The price is almost never almost never at the interior solution, basically. Why is that? Because there is a vertical demand supply for permits, and there is a very vertical demand curve for, this is the supply of carbon emissions reduction. Why is this? This happens because California has complementary policies, such as renewable portfolio standards, that end up reducing carbon emissions anyway. So it's like the emission trading scheme here it's like redundant, basically. So what is their message? Well, you need to design these markets with very careful values for the price floor and the price cap. That's the whole message. Okay, I'm done. So new challenges for electricity markets. The integration of renewable energy technologies. We have decarbonization goals, integration of emerging technologies. And here I talk about market design recommendations on how to deal with these challenges. There are other important features that are not addressed here, such as equal treatment of demand and supply in wholesale markets, liquidity of financial products to hedge risks, mechanisms to mitigate market power, etc., etc. I'm not saying that these are less important, it's just that we didn't have the time to talk about them. So, and I want to finish with this. According to a report from the European Commission, market design is the software on which our energy markets run. Yeah? And while energy infrastructure is the hardware. So, from that viewpoint, the message that I want to pass on here today is that make sure that the software, the market design, does not limit the capabilities of the hardware. Thank you very much.